Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today, well, it's to get into one of the most, let's say, complicated and contradictory times in 20th century U.S. history. Yeah, that period right between the two world wars. We're looking at how America was really trying hard to step back from global problems that classic isolationist urge, but at the same time, its own ambitions, especially economic ones, and its unilateral actions just kept pulling it back onto the world stage. It created this really fascinating but ultimately fragile policy setup. It's like trying to have your cake and eat it too, right? And it led straight towards a huge crisis.
Right. And when you dig into the sources from that time, what really hits you is the sheer weight of disillusionment after 1918. The American people felt, well, kind of betrayed by the Great War, by what it didn't achieve. So our goal here is to trace how that deep collective trauma really shaped policy, how the government tried to meet the public's desire for withdrawal while also promoting American economic interests abroad. It really is almost like political schizophrenia.
Okay, let's unpack that initial sharp turn then. America went into World War I with all this idealism.
Yeah, idealistic fervor.
But the end. Just immediate, brutal exhaustion. The trauma was deep, and the move towards isolationism felt almost instant.
It really was. And, that mood was perfectly captured by Warren G. Harding's campaign slogan in 1920, a return to normalcy. That wasn't just a catchphrase, it was like a psychological promise, It meant stability, getting back to how things were supposedly before the war, a focus on America first, rejecting global idealism for nationalism. They were tired of what they called internationality.
And the biggest symbol of rejecting that whole global project, Congress refusing to join the League of Nations. I mean, President Wilson put everything into that vision of collective security.
And Congress just said no. Emphatically.
Yeah.
And look, that decision wasn't just petty politics. It was really fundamental to the whole interwar approach. By rejecting the League, the U.S. made it crystal clear it wanted total unilateral control over its foreign policy. No binding alliances, no commitments that could drag them into another European mess.
They were willing to engage, but strictly on their own terms.
Exactly. It was like declaring independence from global responsibility.
Okay, so here's where it gets tricky, right? Because that political independence, it created this paradox that really defined the 1920s. We call it isolationist, but the sources show that was mostly just talk, the rhetoric. In reality, the U.S. was incredibly active overseas, economically, diplomatically, sometimes even militarily pushing its own interests, isolated only from the stuff they didn't want to deal with.
That unilateralism, it's super clear when you look at the economics, especially how they handled the post-WWI mess.
Yeah.
Take the Dawes Plan, 1924. Pretty sophisticated stuff, actually. It restructured German reparations, got American loans flowing to help rebuild Europe.
So why do that if you're trying to be isolated?
Well, because American prosperity was tied to European stability. Simple as that. If Europe's economy tanked, our investments would disappear, and they couldn't buy American goods. So the Dawes Plan was about stabilizing things, sure, but mainly to protect U.S. interests, U.S. money. We were the world's banker, like it or not.
Okay, but wait. If the U.S. is trying to stabilize Europe so they can buy our stuff and pay back loans, how does that fit with those huge protective tariffs they were putting up, like the Ford-Macomber Act in 22, and then, oh boy, the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930?
Yes. That is the absolute core contradiction of the whole era. You have to grasp this. The U.S. was effectively shooting itself in the foot. These tariffs jacked up import taxes like crazy.
To protect American industries, right? The classic isolationist move.
Exactly. But by doing that, by raising these walls, we made it almost impossible for European countries to sell their goods in the U.S. market.
Which meant they couldn't earn the dollars they needed to pay back the American loans from the Dawes Plan.
Precisely. It's madness when you think about it. We're acting as the world's banker, lending money, and the world's gatekeeper, blocking trade. It just created this incredibly unstable global financial system. Short-term domestic protection won out over long-term global economic health.
And it wasn't just economics. Even the high-minded diplomacy had this weird contradiction, like the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. Sounds amazing, right? Over 60 nations signed this thing renouncing war.
Sounds incredibly idealistic, doesn't it? A wonderful idea on paper. But look closer. First, it was negotiated outside the League of Nations, sticking to that unilateral approach. And second, here's the real kicker, absolutely no enforcement mechanism, no penalties if someone broke the pledge.
So just symbolic.
Totally symbolic. It was political theater, basically. Made people feel good, maybe, but didn't commit the U.S. to doing anything if war actually broke out.
And if anyone needs proof that isolationism really just meant stay out of Europe's problems, Just look south towards Latin America. The U.S. occupation of Haiti started in 1915, didn't end until 1934, almost 20 years.
Yeah, that's a crucial detail people often forget. While Washington was avoiding commitments in Geneva or London, U.S. Marines were down in Haiti. Why? Protecting American economic interests, banks, sugar companies, all under the banner of promoting stability, of course.
So isolationism had geographic limits.
Absolutely. It meant avoiding risky alliances, particularly in Europe. It definitely didn't mean avoiding military action if American profits were on the line, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Our interests came first there, period.
Okay, so this whole shaky setup, this contradictory policy, it finally starts to crumble in the 1930s. Because suddenly you have these aggressive expansionist regimes popping up, Germany, Italy, Japan. The whole global dynamic shifts violently.
Yeah, things get really serious really fast. That Kellogg-Briand Pact suddenly looks completely naive, almost laughable. You've got Japan invading Manchuria in 31, Italy taking Ethiopia in 36, Germany marching back into the Rhineland the same year. The world is clearly heading towards another major war.
But the U.S. response, still stubbornly neutral, right?
Right. Overwhelmingly so, at least publicly and in Congress. This kicked off what historians call the Great Debate. It tore the country apart.
Pitting the memory of WWI against this new totalitarian threat.
Exactly. The isolationist side was incredibly strong, and you have to remember why. It was rooted in that WWI trauma. Over 100,000 Americans died, and for what? Many felt it achieved nothing lasting, certainly not stable democracy in Europe.
And wasn't there that whole merchants of death argument fueling it?
Oh, hugely. The idea, pushed hard by some investigations and media, was that arms makers and bankers had actually profited from WWI, maybe even dragged the U.S. into it for financial gain. Whether entirely true or not, it created massive public distrust, and that led directly to Congress passing the Neutrality Acts.
Laws specifically designed to prevent involvement.
Right. Banning arms sales, banning loans to nations at war. The thinking was, if you remove the profit motive, you remove the risk of getting sucked in again.
But the other side, the interventionists, they must have been getting louder as the 30s went on.
They were. Their argument was basically, look, history is history, but technology has changed the game. Bombers, submarines, the Atlantic Ocean wasn't the protective barrier it used to be. Isolation was becoming an illusion.
And a Nazi victory.
A direct threat to the Americas, they argued, and a threat to the very idea of democracy everywhere. It was an existential fight, not just another European squabble.
So the country's paralyzed. Polls show people sympathize with Britain and France, but no way do they want to send troops.
An impossible spot for President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Right, FDR enters the chat. He clearly saw the danger, especially from Nazi Germany, and definitely sympathized with the Allies, particularly Britain.
Intensely so.
But he couldn't just come out and say, we need to get ready for war.
Yeah.
The isolationist sentiment was too strong.
He couldn't. He had to perform this incredibly delicate balancing act, what the sources call a gradual political tightrope walk.
Step by step, trying to help Britain without triggering massive opposition at home, basically bending the rules of neutrality without openly breaking them.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to watch how those steps chipped away at the Neutrality Acts, at genuine neutrality. The first big one was cash and carry in 1939.
Remind us how that worked again. It sounds pretty neutral on the surface.
Well, it was a clever workaround. It tweaked the Neutrality Acts. Okay, warring nations could buy U.S. arms, and these are big buts, they had to pay cash up front, no loans,
Okay.
and they had to use their own ships to transport the weapons, no risk to American ships, no American credit involved.
So who does that actually help?
Britain and France, primarily. They still had the cash at that point, and they controlled the seas enough to pick up the goods. It was designed to aid them while letting FDR tell isolationists, see, we're not getting involved.
A neat political trick. But by 1940, France had fallen. Britain was standing alone. The situation was way more desperate. Cash wasn't enough.
Right, which led to the next much bigger step, the destroyers for bases deal.
Okay, this sounds less neutral already.
It was a much clearer move away from neutrality, a direct swap. The U.S. gave Britain 50 older destroyers, desperately needed for convoy protection.
And in return?
The U.S. got 99-year leases on British naval and air bases in the Western Hemisphere, like Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Caribbean.
How did Roosevelt sell that one?
As a brilliant move for American defense, strengthening our own security by acquiring strategic bases. The fact it was also propping up Britain was presented as a secondary benefit.
Clever. But the final nail in the coffin for real isolationism, that had to be the Lend-Lease Act in early 41.
March 1941, yes. Lend-Lease basically threw all pretense of neutrality out the window. It allowed the U.S. to lend or lease arms and supplies to any country whose defense the president deemed vital to U.S. security. Crucially, this bypassed the cash part of cash and carry. Payment could be deferred or made in kind.
So essentially giving allies weapons on credit.
Exactly. Roosevelt famously used the analogy of lending your neighbor a garden hose if their house is on fire. You don't haggle over the price, you just lend the hose.
And this officially makes the U.S.
The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it. By mid-1941, America was fully committed to supplying the Allies, massively mobilized for war production, even though technically still not a belligerent. The era of trying to stay out was effectively over, even before Pearl Harbor.
But the thing that finally ended the debate, unified the country, wasn't a law or a speech. It was a shock.
A devastating shock. December 7th, 1941, the surprise Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
Killing over 2,400 Americans, crippling the Pacific Fleet.
And just like that, the great debate ended overnight. The sources are clear. The attack instantly unified the American public. All that isolationist sentiment, all the resistance to intervention, gone.
Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan the very next day. Got it almost unanimously.
And then just days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. And that was it. America was fully in World War II.
That moment, Pearl Harbor, it marks this irreversible shift, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The whole policy of trying to stay engaged economically but detached militarily, that just shattered. The U.S. was pulled out of that unilateral shell and thrust into a role of global leadership that would last for decades.
So looking back at this whole journey, from Harding's return to normalcy and rejecting the League,
Right, rejecting collective security.
all the way to full-blown intervention, it seems like it pivoted on two main things. First, economic self-interest in the 20s.
Definitely. Protecting investments, finding markets.
And then second, the sheer existential threat from those totalitarian regimes in the 30s.
An unavoidable threat, yeah. Once Germany and Japan looked like they could actually dominate Eurasia, the calculation changed entirely.
So I guess the key takeaway for you, listening, is that the interwar period wasn't passive. It wasn't really isolation.
No, not at all. It was this constant, messy, deeply flawed balancing act. You had American ideals about democracy bumping up against hardy economic needs, all filtered through the lingering trauma of World War I. The result: policies that often contradicted each other, sometimes spectacularly.
Which brings us to a final thought. The sources really emphasize how the U.S. used its money, international investments, trade deals like the Dawes Plan to try and shape the world order, even while politicians were talking isolationism.
Economic engagement was constant.
So considering that, how much did that deep economic entanglement in the 1920s basically make the military intervention of the 1940s almost inevitable? Was the economy always pulling the U.S. towards global involvement, no matter what the isolationists in Congress wanted?
Was military intervention just the logical conclusion of that earlier economic policy, regardless of the rhetoric? That's definitely something worth thinking about.